On the night of October 24, 1942, a Japanese captain named Jiro Katsumata lay flat in the mud at the edge of a jungle clearing on the island of Guadalcanal and waited for the signal to charge. Behind him, stretched out in a ragged column through rain-soaked jungle so dark that each man had smeared glowing rot from dead trees onto the backpack of the man in front just to follow him, were the remains of his company. 170 soldiers of the 11th Company, 3rd Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Division of the Imperial Japanese Army. They had marched for 9 days through some of the worst terrain on earth to reach this spot. They had eaten nothing but handfuls of raw rice for the last 3. They had abandoned their artillery on the trail because there were no horses, and 40 men could not drag a field gun up a jungle cliff in the dark. They had been told by their commanding general that this was the decisive battle between Japan and the United States, that the rise or fall of the Japanese Empire would be decided on this night, and that no man should expect to return alive to Japan. And Katsumata believed it. He believed that the airfield behind the American lines, the one the Americans called Henderson Field, was the key to the entire Pacific. He believed that the Americans holding it were weak, sick, outnumbered, and afraid. He believed that the force moving through the jungle behind him, nearly 7,000 men of the Sendai Division, was unstoppable. He believed that Japanese spirit, the ancient warrior code that said death in battle was lighter than a feather, would carry his men through whatever fire they met. 30 minutes later, most of his company was dead. They had hit the American wire at roughly 0030 hours. October 25, Katsumata's men charged into double-apron barbed wire, strung with tin cans full of pebbles that rattled when touched. The rattling lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the machine guns opened. Not one gun, not 3. A wall of interlocking fire from heavy 30-caliber machine guns, light machine guns, Browning automatic rifles, and 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, which turned each gun into a giant shotgun spraying hundreds of steel balls into the charging ranks. Behind the machine guns, American mortars dropped rounds into the wire. Behind the mortars, the 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment, with 2 howitzer battalions directly supporting Puller's sector, poured high explosive onto the approaches and assembly areas where the rest of the battalion was waiting to follow. By 0100 hours, 30 minutes after the charge began, most of Katsumata's company had been killed. He himself had been hit 3 times, in the cheek, the knee, and the ankle. He lay in the mud among the bodies of his men and listened to the machine guns continue firing into the darkness. Then he began to crawl. It took him the rest of the night to drag himself back through a field of dead men he had led there an hour before. He later described the scene in a personal narrative that survived the war. He said the dead were piled so thick in front of the wire that the men behind them tripped over the bodies of the men in front. If this story matters to you, a like is the single best way to help it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered. Katsumata was not the only Japanese officer who could not understand what he had run into that night. Across the entire southern perimeter of the American position at Henderson Field, from the edge of the jungle to the banks of the Lunga River, Japanese soldiers of the Sendai Division charged into the same wall of fire and died in the same way, by the hundreds, in waves that came all night long. 6 major assaults hit the American line between 2200 hours on October 24 and dawn on October 25. Every one of them was stopped, not slowed, stopped. The Japanese dead piled up in front of the wire in numbers that burial details would spend days counting. When the sun rose on October 25, a body count detail walked the ground in front of the American positions and tallied 1,462 Japanese dead. 1,462, in front of a single American battalion. The battalion that killed them had fewer than 700 men. Captured Japanese diaries from the battle tell the same story from the other side, and the tone of those diaries is not defiance, it is bewilderment. A private, named Kamikichi Kusano, 7th Company, 2nd Battalion of the 29th Infantry, wrote that his regiment was led into a trap and that the majority of the regiment was killed. He wrote that the dead were piled 3 and 4 deep. A first lieutenant named Kozaburo Miyazawa, commanding the 2nd Machine Gun Company, recorded that the 3rd Battalion was almost annihilated and that the regimental commander himself, Colonel Masajiro Furumiya, had penetrated the American position with a small force but made no progress. Miyazawa tallied the 29th Infantry's losses at roughly 350 killed, 500 wounded, and 200 missing. That was more than 1,000 men gone from a single regiment in a single night. And the commander of the entire attacking force, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, had been so confident of victory that his staff had prepared plans for the American surrender ceremony to be heralded by a radio code word. That code word was Banzai. No one sent it. The question that hangs over all of this, the question the Japanese officers who survived that night asked themselves for years afterward, is simple. How did 700 Americans hold a 2,500-yard perimeter, a line so thin it stretched a single battalion across ground that should have required a full regiment, against a division of 7,000 men, attacking with the kind of suicidal determination that had broken every enemy Japan had faced since 1895? How did a position that its own commander considered only 30% complete become a killing ground so devastating that it destroyed the combat power of one of the finest divisions in the Imperial Japanese Army in a single point? Night? The answer is not in the wire. It is not in the guns. It is not in the artillery, although the artillery was murderous. The answer is in a man, and the story of that man does not begin on Guadalcanal. It begins 23 years earlier, in a place no one remembers, in a war no one talks about, in a jungle on the other side of the world, where a young Marine learned every lesson that would matter on the night of October 24, 1942. But before we get to that man, you need to understand what Henderson Field was, and why every commander in the Pacific, Japanese and American alike, understood that whoever held it held the key to the entire South Pacific. Henderson Field was a half-finished airstrip on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, a malaria-infested island in the Solomon Chain that no one outside the region had heard of before 1942. The Japanese had begun building the airfield in July. The Marines landed on August 7 and secured the nearly complete airstrip the following day. They named it after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. Within days, Marine pilots of what came to be called the Cactus Air Force were flying from it, and those pilots changed the arithmetic of the entire campaign. During daylight hours, the Cactus Air Force controlled the sky and the sea around Guadalcanal. Japanese transport ships could not approach the island without being attacked. This forced the Japanese to resupply their forces by night, using fast destroyers in runs the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Destroyers could carry men but not heavy equipment. They could deliver rice and ammunition in drums pushed over the side to float ashore, but they could not deliver artillery, tanks, trucks, or the tonnage of supplies that a division-sized force needed to conduct sustained offensive operations. As long as Henderson Field operated, the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was slowly starving. As long as the Cactus Air Force flew, the Japanese Navy could not achieve the sea control it needed to reinforce and resupply at scale. And as long as the Americans held the island, Japan's advance toward Australia and the critical sea lanes of the South Pacific was blocked. Henderson Field was not just an airstrip. It was the hinge of the Pacific War in the autumn of 1942. Lose it, and the American foothold on Guadalcanal would become untenable. Hold it, and the Japanese offensive that had swept across the Pacific since December of 1941 would be stopped for good. The Japanese High Command understood this completely, and that is why they sent the Sendai Division. Now you need to understand why the Japanese believed so completely that they would win, because the Japanese plan was not reckless, it was not improvised. It was the product of a military tradition that had been undefeated for half a century, and it was built on an assumption that had never failed them. That assumption was about to be destroyed. The Japanese military doctrine of 1942 rested on a concept called seishin, which translates roughly as fighting spirit or force of will. Seishin was not simply a motivational slogan, it was the operational foundation of Japanese infantry tactics. The Japanese officer corps believed, with the conviction of men whose entire professional education had confirmed it, that a force with superior spirit could overcome a force with superior firepower. This belief was not irrational, it was based on evidence. At Port Arthur in 1905, Japanese infantry had stormed Russian fortifications through machine gun fire and won. In Manchuria in 1931, Small Japanese units had routed larger Chinese forces through speed and aggression. In Malaya in 1942, the 25th Army had destroyed the British defence of Singapore in 70 days, moving so fast that the defenders could never establish a stable line. Every one of these victories reinforced the same lesson. The side that attacks with more determination wins. The side that accepts higher casualties wins. The side that refuses to stop advancing breaks the enemy's will before the enemy's firepower breaks theirs. And so, when Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama led his Sendai Division down a 35-mile trail, hacked through the jungle by hand, with each soldier carrying his pack, his rifle, and one artillery round on his back, he did not consider the operation desperate. He considered it decisive. He had 7,000 men. The Americans, as far as Japanese intelligence knew, had perhaps 10,000 on the entire island, spread across a perimeter several miles wide. Maruyama was concentrating his full strength against one section of that perimeter. The arithmetic by Japanese doctrine was clear. Mass plus spirit equals breakthrough. What Maruyama could not know was that the Americans had made a decision on October 24 that would leave his target sector defended by exactly one battalion. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hanniken, was pulled from its position on the southern line and sent west to the Matanikau, where a diversionary force under Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi had attacked prematurely the day before. Sumiyoshi had sent a tank company across the Matanikau sandbar straight into Marine 37mm anti-tank guns and massed artillery. The tanks were destroyed, and hundreds of Japanese infantry were killed in the open. But the attack convinced the American command that the main Japanese effort might come from the west, and Hanniken's battalion was repositioned accordingly. This left Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, holding the entire southern face of the perimeter alone, 2,500 yards of front. 700 men, no reserve. Every other sector of the perimeter had supporting units, adjacent battalions, reserves that could be shifted. Puller had nothing behind him except the airfield and the artillery. He did not complain. He walked his line, checked his positions, and waited. The man who would prove Maruyama's arithmetic wrong had been proving conventional military thinking wrong for most of his adult life. Lewis Burwell Puller was born on June 26, 1898, in West Point, Virginia, a small town on the York River where his family had lived for generations. He was a distant cousin of George Patton, although the two men could not have been more different in temperament. Patton was an aristocrat who studied war at West Point and in the libraries of Europe. Puller was a country boy who worshipped Stonewall Jackson and wanted nothing more than to fight. He enrolled at the Virginia Military Institute in 1917, but he did not stay. The war in Europe was on, and Puller wanted to be in it. He left VMI after 1 year, enlisted in the Marine Corps, and received a reserve commission as a second lieutenant in 1919. Then the war ended, the Corps shrank, and Puller was placed on inactive status before he had heard a shot fired in anger. What happened next is the part that matters, because it is the part that made Henderson Field possible. Puller re-enlisted as a corporal and volunteered for Haiti. The United States was occupying the country, and the Marines were running a constabulary force called the Gendarmerie de Haiti, a Haitian enlisted, Marine-officered outfit that was fighting Caco rebels in the mountains. Puller served as a lieutenant in the Gendarmerie for 5 years, from 1919 to 1924, and fought in approximately 40 engagements. 40. Not large battles with maps and orders and supply trains. Small, close, brutal fights in jungle terrain against an enemy who knew the ground, used ambush and surprise, and attacked when you were weakest. In those 5 years, Puller learned things that no peacetime military school could teach. He learned how to read terrain in dense jungle. He learned how to set fields of fire in vegetation so thick you could not see 30 feet. He learned that the side that prepares its position and waits will almost always defeat the side that charges into it, no matter how brave the charging side is. He received a permanent Marine commission in 1924 and was sent to Nicaragua in 1928, where he did it all over again. The Guardia Nacional, another Marine-officered force, was fighting Augusto Sandino's guerrillas in the mountains of northern Nicaragua. Puller led patrols through jungle so dense that men had to cut their way forward with machetes. He fought in engagement after engagement, earning his first Navy Cross for leading 5 successive actions against forces that outnumbered his in every fight. He returned to Nicaragua in 1932 and earned a second Navy Cross. Remember this detail. By 1932, Louis Puller had spent nearly a decade fighting small wars in jungles. He had learned that firepower, properly positioned and properly controlled, defeats mass. He had learned that a prepared position with interlocking fields of fire is nearly impossible to take by frontal assault. He had learned that a commander must be forward with his men, close enough to see what is happening, close enough to make decisions in real time, close enough that his presence alone steadies the line. These were not lessons from a textbook. These were lessons written in the bodies of men who had charged his positions and died. And then Puller did something that would prove equally important. He went to China. In the 1930s, Puller served 2 tours in China, first commanding the Marine detachment aboard the heavy cruiser Augusta under a captain named Chesty Nimitz, and later as executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, stationed in Shanghai. During these years, Puller observed both the Japanese and Chinese armies at close range. He watched the Japanese conduct operations in the Shanghai area. He studied their infantry tactics, their officer behavior, and their approach to battle. He saw their reliance on the frontal assault, their willingness to absorb enormous casualties, their belief that moral force could compensate for material weakness. He respected their courage. But he also identified their vulnerability. Japanese tactical doctrine, he observed, depended on momentum and shock. It was designed to overwhelm a defender before the defender could organize effective fire. If the defender held, if the defender's fire was sustained and accurate and coordinated, the Japanese attack had no fallback. There was no doctrine for what to do when the charge failed, because the charge was not supposed to fail. Puller filed this observation away. 10 years later, on a jungle perimeter on Guadalcanal, he would use it. When Puller arrived on Guadalcanal on September 18, 1942, with his 1st Battalion Seventh Marines, the situation on the island was precarious. The 1st Marine Division had been ashore since August 7, holding a perimeter around Henderson Field against a Japanese garrison that grew stronger with every Tokyo Express delivery. The Marines were outnumbered. They were undersupplied. The Navy, after losing 4 heavy cruisers at the Battle of Savo Island on the 2nd night of the campaign, had pulled back, leaving the Marines without reliable sea support. Puller's first major action came along the Guadalcanal River on September 27, a savage fight in which 3 of his companies were nearly cut off behind Japanese lines. Puller ran to the shoreline, waved down the destroyer Monson, and directed naval gunfire to cover the extraction of his men by landing craft. Coast Guard signalman First Class Douglas Munro was killed providing covering fire during the evacuation and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only Coast Guardsman ever to receive it. The Matanikau fighting taught Puller the terrain around Henderson Field and gave him a first-hand measure of the Japanese infantry he would soon be defending against. Then came the night of October 13. On that night, Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, closed to within range of Henderson Field and fired 973 14-inch shells into the American perimeter over 83 minutes. The bombardment destroyed 48 of the Cactus Air Force's 90 aircraft, burned most of the aviation fuel, killed 41 men, and left the survivors shaken to a degree that many would later describe as the most terrifying experience of their lives. A captain in Puller's battalion said there is nothing more demoralizing than naval gunfire, because you can hear each round leave the ship and come in like a freight train. The soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment had landed on Guadalcanal that same day and endured their first night ashore under 14-inch shells. 11 days later, those same soldiers would be fed into Puller's line in the middle of the most desperate fight of the campaign. Here is what Puller built in the weeks before the Japanese attacked, and here is why it matters, because this is the part the Japanese never saw. They saw the wire, they saw the guns. They saw the muzzle flashes, but they did not see the weeks of preparation that turned a strip of jungle into a killing ground designed by a man who had been building killing grounds since he was 21 years old. The southern perimeter of Henderson Field was not a trench line in the European sense. It was a series of fighting positions, log and sandbag bunkers sunk into the earth along a 2,500-yard arc that faced south toward the jungle. Puller had his men clear fields of fire in front of each position, cutting away underbrush and small trees so that the machine guns had unobstructed lanes of fire extending outward from the line. He had them string double-apron barbed wire across the approaches, and he had them hang empty ration cans filled with pebbles on the wire, so that any man who touched it in the dark would announce his own arrival. He had them dig deep fighting holes with overhead cover of logs and packed earth, positions that could survive mortar fire and still allow a Marine to fire his weapon over the parapet. He had them register every mortar tube on pre-selected target points in the open ground to the south, the flat grassy area the Marines called the bowling alley, so that when the Japanese crossed it, the mortars could drop rounds on them without the gunners needing to see. And behind all of this, Puller coordinated with the 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment, to register their 105mm howitzers on the approaches, the assembly areas, and the jungle trails that any attacking force would have to use. Every gun had pre-calculated firing data for dozens of targets. When the time came, a forward observer in Puller's line could call a target number and have shells landing within minutes. The anti-tank platoon was positioned in the front line with 5 30 caliber machine guns, 2 50 caliber machine guns, and 4 37mm guns. Those 37mm guns were the weapon the Japanese would fear most that night, because loaded with canister, each round sprayed hundreds of steel balls in a spreading cone, like a shotgun the size of a small cannon. Against massed infantry in the open, at close range, canister was devastating. Puller considered his defensive works only 30% complete. One of his officers later called it the best fixed defensive position since the First World War. Now here is the detail that separates what happened at Henderson Field from what the Japanese expected to happen. Everything Puller built was designed around a single principle he had learned in Haiti and Nicaragua. The principle was this: make the enemy come to you, make him cross open ground, make him hit the wire, and when he hits the wire, kill him with everything you have before he can get through it. Do not wait, do not hold fire, do not try to be clever. Pour fire into the kill zone and do not stop until there is nothing left standing in it. This was not how most commanders on Guadalcanal had fought. Previous defensive actions, including the critical battle at Edson's Ridge in September, had involved mobile defense, fallback positions, and counterattacks. Puller's approach was simpler and more brutal. Hold the line, kill everything in front of it, do not give ground. The Japanese plan, by contrast, was built on the opposite assumption. The Japanese assumed the Americans were spread thin, poorly supplied, sick with malaria, and demoralized. Some of this was true. The 1st Marine Division had been on Guadalcanal since August 7th, 1942, nearly 3 months without relief. The men were eating 2 meals a day, much of it captured Japanese rice. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fungal infections were epidemic. The naval bombardment of October 13 and 14, when Japanese battleships Congo and Haruna fired 973 14-inch shells into the perimeter over 83 minutes, had destroyed most of the Cactus Air Force's planes and shattered whatever sense of security the garrison still had. Marines who survived that bombardment called it the worst night of their lives. But Puller's First Battalion, 7th Marines, was in better shape than most. They had arrived on September 18, barely 5 weeks earlier, and while they had already fought hard along the Guadalcanal River, the malaria that was destroying the rest of the division had not yet taken hold, because the disease's incubation period meant the battalion was still largely healthy. Puller's men were tired, underweight, and operating on short rations, but they could fight. The Japanese could not know any of this. They could not know because they had conducted no reconnaissance of the southern perimeter. They had simply assumed, based on the intelligence failure that would cost them everything, that the southern jungle was undefended. Lieutenant General Maruyama's plan called for the main attack to come from the south, through the jungle, hitting the perimeter where the Americans least expected it. A diversionary force under Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi would attack from the west along the coast near the Guadalcanal, drawing American attention and reserves away from the real assault. The main body, Maruyama's Sendai Division, would march south of the American perimeter on a trail hacked through the jungle by engineers, swing east, and assault the southern line from the jungle edge. The trail that would carry this force to its attack position was called the Maruyama Trail, and Maruyama was so confident of success that he approved having it named after himself. The trail nearly destroyed his division before it reached the Americans. 35 miles of hand-cut path, 15 of them through the bottom jungle, the worst terrain on the island, rivers that rose to chest height in the rain. ravines so steep that men had to haul themselves up by vines, mud so deep that soldiers sank to their knees with every step, jungle so thick that the column moved in near-total darkness even during the day. A Japanese sergeant named Hisakichi Hara of the 230th Infantry described vines armed with thorns wrapping around the soldiers' necks. He described the men smearing luminous rot from dead trees onto each other's backpacks so they could see the man in front of them in the darkness. He described reaching the Lunga River crossing on what was supposed to be the day the offensive began and discovering there was no airfield in sight and 15 to 20 kilometers of rough trail still ahead. He described the provisions having already reached the bottom. The march was supposed to take 3 days. It took 9. Along the way, the soldiers abandoned their artillery, their heavy mortars, and much of their ammunition because there were no pack animals, and the trails were too steep and narrow for large weapons to be manhandled through. By the time the Sendai Division reached its attack positions south of Henderson Field on the night of October 24, the soldiers had been on half rations of raw rice for days. They were exhausted, dehydrated, starving, and disorganized. The 2 wings of the attack, the left wing under Major General Yumio Nasu and the right wing now under Colonel Toshinari Shoji after Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had been relieved for refusing orders, had lost contact with each other in the jungle and could not coordinate their attacks. And yet they still believed they would win, because Saishin, fighting spirit, was supposed to overcome all of this. The soldiers had been told they would feast on captured American rations when they took the airfield. They spoke of Roosevelt rations, breakfast biscuits, and coffee. A Japanese lieutenant recorded in his diary a different reality. He wrote that many soldiers feared the enemy gunfire, and that the morale of the soldiers was very poor. But morale or no morale, they were going forward. The intelligence failure that shaped the attack was catastrophic. The Japanese had conducted no reconnaissance of the southern perimeter. They had assumed it was lightly defended or undefended entirely, repeating the same mistake the Kawaguchi Brigade had made at Edson's Ridge in September. They estimated only about 10,000 Americans on the entire island. There were actually closer to 23,000, including the newly arrived 164th Infantry. They had not marked approach lanes through the jungle, which meant that in the darkness and the rain, the 2 wings of the attack drifted off course. Shoji's right wing turned parallel to the American lines and largely missed contact entirely. Nasu's left wing drifted toward the center and left of Puller's position, which meant that instead of hitting the perimeter in a coordinated blow along its entire length, the Japanese struck in piecemeal, uncoordinated surges that allowed Puller to concentrate his fire against each wave as it arrived. So confident was the Japanese High Command that, at 0050 hours on October 25, before the battle's outcome was remotely clear, General Hyakutake radioed his headquarters at Rabaul with the message that the right wing had captured the airfield. The report was false. Shoji's men had stumbled onto an open field in the jungle and mistaken it for Henderson Field. The message was rescinded at 0430, but by then, Rabaul had already begun celebrating. On the American side, the first warning came at approximately 2100 hours on the evening of October 24. Puller had placed a 46-man observation post on a knoll about 1,500 yards south of his line, commanded by Platoon Sergeant Ralph Briggs. Briggs called in on the field telephone. Large numbers of Japanese were moving past his position. They were singing, they were smoking cigarettes, they were heading directly toward Puller's line. Puller ordered Briggs to hold his fire, slip his men to the left across the open ground, and pass back through the American lines. "Do not fail," he told Briggs, "and do not go in any other direction. I will hold my fire as long as I can." Of the 46 men in the outpost, 3 were killed and 10 were wounded, making their way back. The last man, a private first class named Wallace Wynne, spent 2 weeks alone in the jungle before finding his way home. What happened next began at approximately 2200 hours and did not stop until dawn. The first Japanese unit to hit the wire stumbled into the line near the junction between the 7th Marines and the 164th Infantry sector. It was driven off, but it was only the beginning. Behind that first group, stretched back through the jungle in a column that extended for miles, was the main body of the Sendai Division, still trying to sort itself into attack formation in terrain so dense that units could not find each other. At approximately 0030 hours on October 25, Captain Katsumata's 11th Company, Third Battalion, 29th Infantry, attacked Company A of Puller's battalion. They hit the wire and the machine guns opened. Katsumata later described the scene. His men were cut down in the wire. The ones behind them tripped over the bodies and were cut down in turn. By 0100, most of his company was dead or dying. He himself lay wounded in 3 places, listening to the guns. 15 minutes later, at approximately 0115, the 9th Company of the same battalion charged Company C of Puller's line. A Marine machine gun section led by Sergeant John Basilone killed almost the entire company within 5 minutes. Remember that name, John Basilone. His story belongs later in this account, but you need to know his name now, because what he did over the next several hours with 2 sections of heavy machine guns was the act that held the center of Puller's line when it could have broken. The Japanese attacks continued. Wave after wave, driven forward by officers waving swords, by sergeants beating men with canes, by the terrible momentum of a military tradition that said retreat was worse than death. They came through the bowling alley in the moonlight, and the machine guns cut them down. They came along the edges of the jungle, and the mortars found them. They came in groups of 50 and 100 and 200, screaming, stumbling over their own dead, and the 37mm canister rounds turned each charge into a slaughter. Behind Puller's line, the 11th Marines artillery poured fire onto the jungle trails and assembly areas. Forward observers in the fighting positions called target after target, and the howitzers responded with a volume of fire that staggered the Japanese. Captured documents would later show that the Japanese believed the Americans never fight without artillery. They were right. The artillery was devastating, and on this night, it was decisive. Shells landed on Japanese units, still forming up in the jungle, killing men before they ever reached the open ground. In the early hours of the fighting, Puller walked the line, moving from position to position, checking fields of fire, redistributing ammunition, steadying men who had never been under fire this intense. As the attacks intensified, and the need to coordinate artillery, ammunition resupply, and the coming reinforcements grew urgent, he moved to his battalion command post and worked the field telephone, calling in fire missions, relaying reports to regiment, and directing the defense from a position where he could manage the entire 2,500-yard front. He was close enough to the fighting that the sounds of the battle and the smell of the cordite were immediate and constant. This was the lesson from Haiti and Nicaragua. A commander stays close enough that his men know he is there, and he stays connected enough that he can shape the fight as it changes. Back at the regimental command post, the staff of the 7th Marines could hear the fighting and could follow it only through the field telephone reports coming in from Puller's positions. A Marine on the regimental staff, overwhelmed by the volume of fire rolling across the southern perimeter, said aloud what everyone in the command post was thinking. He said he was glad Colonel Puller was there. The division operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Twining, who had worked with Puller since the early days of the campaign, later said that Puller's presence alone was the equivalent of 2 extra battalions. That was not flattery. It was an operational assessment from a man who understood that in a fight like this, the commander's calm, his refusal to panic, and his ability to hold the defense together through sheer force of will were worth more than any reserve that could have been committed. Platoon Sergeant Briggs, the man who had run the observation post, later described Puller during the battle with a revealing detail. He said the colonel digested every report calmly, as though he was sitting in his tent at New River, instead of in the mud and blood. That composure was not indifference. It was control. Puller had seen worse in Haiti. He had seen worse in Nicaragua. He had spent 23 years preparing for exactly this kind of night, and when it came, he was the steadiest man on the island. When Captain Regan Fuller of Company A called to report that his men were running low on ammunition, Puller's response was immediate and characteristically blunt. "You have got bayonets, have you not?" That single sentence, transmitted over a field telephone in the middle of the worst night of the Guadalcanal campaign, tells you everything about the man. He was not being callous. He was telling Fuller that the line would hold, that there would be no withdrawal, and that if the ammunition ran out, the Marines would fight with what they had left. Fuller got the message. The line held. But ammunition was a real crisis, and nowhere more so than in the machine gun sections. The heavy 30 caliber machine guns were the backbone of the defense. They fired so continuously that the barrels overheated and the water in the cooling jackets boiled away. Without water, the barrels would warp and the guns would jam, and without the guns, the line would break. This is where Sergeant John Basilone earned the Medal of Honor. Basilone was a machine gunner from Raritan, New Jersey, a former Army soldier who had served in the Philippines before joining the Marines. He was 25 years old on the night of October 24. He belonged to D Company, the battalion's weapons company, and his 2 sections of heavy machine guns were positioned in support of Company C's sector of the line. When the Japanese attacks intensified, Basilone did not simply fire his guns. He became the living engine that kept the entire section of the line operational. He repaired jammed guns under fire, clearing stoppages while Japanese soldiers threw themselves against the wire 30 yards in front of him. When one gun position was silenced, he picked up a 90-pound machine gun and its tripod, ran 200 yards through fire to the silenced position, set the gun up, and began firing point-blank into the charging Japanese. He told his crews to urinate into the water jackets to keep the barrels cool, because the water was gone and there was no time to refill them from the rear. He ran ammunition to his guns through fire so intense that a private first class named Nash Phillips, who fought beside him and lost a hand that night, later said that Basilone kept a machine gun firing through the entire battle without sleep, rest, or food, that his face was dirty black from gunfire and exhaustion, that he had a .45 caliber pistol tucked into the waistband of his trousers. Basilone's guns held Company C's sector. Without them, the Japanese would have broken through the center of Puller's line, and the entire southern perimeter of Henderson Field would have collapsed. Company C would earn a nickname from that night that it carried for the rest of the war and beyond. The Marines called it Suicide Charlie, and after the battle, the company flew a skull and crossbones flag made from parachute silk over its bivouac area. The name was not ironic. The men of Suicide Charlie had held a section of the line where the Japanese dead lay so thick in front of the wire that subsequent waves had to climb over the bodies of the men killed in previous charges. They had fought at distances measured in feet, not yards, and several positions had come down to bayonets and entrenching tools when the ammunition ran out. But the crisis was not over. By 0300 hours, Puller's battalion had been fighting for 5 hours straight. Ammunition was critically low across the line. The Japanese had launched 6 major assaults, and while all had been repulsed, the battalion was exhausted, depleted, and stretched to its absolute limit across 2,500 yards of front. A single, fresh Japanese regiment pushing through at any point could have ended it. And then, at approximately 0330, Colonel Furumiya of the 29th Infantry led 2 companies of his 3rd Battalion and his regimental headquarters through the wire. It was the only significant penetration of the night. Roughly 100 Japanese soldiers carved a salient, approximately 150 yards wide and 100 yards deep into the American position. They were inside the line. This was the moment that should have broken the defense, a penetration of the perimeter, in the dark, with the defenders already exhausted and low on ammunition. In most battles, this is where the line collapses, where defenders abandon their positions because they believe the enemy is behind them. Furumiya's men were behind them. But Puller had been working the field telephone for hours. The division commander, Major General Alexander Vandergrift, was not on the island. He had flown to Noumea, New Caledonia, 2 days earlier to confer with Admiral William Halsey. In his absence, Major General William Rupertus commanded the division, with Colonel Gerald Thomas as Chief of Staff and Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Twining as Operations Officer. Puller called the 7th Marines Regimental Headquarters and told the executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Julian Frisby, that he needed reinforcements. Frisby relayed the request to Thomas and Twining at division. Shortly before midnight, Twining ordered the 164th Infantry to send its reserve battalion forward. The 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, of the Army's Americal Division, had been on Guadalcanal since October 13. They were National Guard soldiers from North Dakota, farm boys and small-town men, the first United States Army unit to take offensive action against Japan in the entire war. They had survived the battleship bombardment on their first night ashore. They were green. They had never been in a fight like this. And they were about to be fed into Puller's line, in the dark, piecemeal, by squads and platoons, into positions held by Marines they had never met, in the middle of the most intense firefight on Guadalcanal since the battle at Edson's Ridge. The man who guided them to the front was the regiment's Catholic chaplain, Father Keough, who knew the trails in the dark when no one else did. He led squads of soldiers forward through mud and falling mortar rounds, depositing them into Marine fighting positions, where sergeants pointed them toward the wire and told them to start shooting. The soldiers of the 164th did not hesitate. They slid into the foxholes, picked up the line, and fought. Puller and the battalion commander of the 3rd of the 164th, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, agreed that Puller would retain overall command, since he already had a handle on the situation. It was an extraordinary act of professional trust. An army battalion commander placed himself and his men under a Marine lieutenant colonel he had never worked with, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a battle, because the situation demanded it, and both men understood what mattered. Puller later praised the soldiers publicly. He told reporters he was damned glad to see them. He said those farm boys can fight. It was the highest compliment Puller knew how to give, and he meant it without reservation. The 164th Infantry would later be awarded the Navy Presidential Unit Citation for its service on Guadalcanal, one of the rare instances of an Army unit receiving a Navy decoration, a measure of how deeply the Marines respected what the soldiers had done alongside them that night and in the weeks that followed. The combined force held through the rest of the night. The Japanese threw 2 more major attacks before dawn. Both were shattered by the same interlocking machine gun fire, the same artillery, and the same 37mm canister that had broken every assault since 2200 hours. When the sun rose on October 25, the ground in front of Puller's line was carpeted with Japanese dead. At 0730, Major General Nasu ordered a withdrawal to regroup for another attempt that night. The Sendai Division pulled back into the jungle, leaving its dead in the wire and in the bowling alley and in the shell-cratered jungle approaches. Puller's men spent the day clearing the salient that Furumiya's men had carved into the line. 104 Japanese soldiers were killed inside the perimeter during the daylight mopping up. Colonel Furumiya did not survive. He had led the only force that penetrated the American position, and when the penetration failed to expand, when no follow-on force came because there was no follow-on force left to send, Furumiya was trapped behind American lines. He was killed on or about October 26. A diary attributed to him was recovered and translated by the 1st Marine Division's intelligence section. In it, he wrote words that carry the weight of a man who knew his regiment had been destroyed. He wrote that he did not know what excuse to give. He wrote that he apologized for what he had done. And he wrote that he was going to return his borrowed life today with short interest. The 29th Infantry's regimental flag, one of the most sacred objects in any Japanese military unit, went missing. It was never recovered by either side. The standard interpretation is that it was destroyed by the Japanese themselves, rather than allow it to be captured. When Maruyama was told at dawn that most of the 29th Regiment had been wiped out and its regimental flag was missing, he reportedly said 2 words, "That is it." But Maruyama was not finished. On the night of October 25 to 26, he committed the 16th Infantry Regiment, alongside the remnants of Nasu's battered force, in renewed attacks on the southern perimeter. This time the main assault fell on the 164th Infantry, and on the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Herman Hanneken, which had been repositioned after the first night. Nasu himself was killed by rifle fire during the assault. By 0800 on October 26, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, the overall Japanese commander on Guadalcanal, called off the offensive and ordered a retreat. The retreat was a horror. The surviving soldiers of the Sendai Division staggered back over the Maruyama Trail, the same trail they had marched with such confidence 9 days earlier. A lieutenant named Keijiro Minagishi kept a diary of the retreat. He wrote that he never dreamed of retreating over the same mountainous trail through the jungle they had crossed with such enthusiasm. He wrote that they had not eaten in 3 days and even walking was difficult. He wrote that on the uphill stretches his body swayed, unable to walk, and he had to rest every 2 meters. The 2nd Division, the Sendai Division, one of the Imperial Japanese Army's most storied formations, was finished as an offensive force. It would never recover. Among its dead were Major General Nasu, Colonel Furumiya of the 29th Infantry, Colonel Toshiro Hiroyasu of the 16th Infantry, and 4 battalion commanders. Total Japanese losses in the battle exceeded 2,000 killed. Some estimates place the figure above 3,000. Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, lost 24 dead, 28 wounded, and 2 missing. Combined American losses for the night action, including the soldiers of the 164th, were approximately 70. 700 Americans against 7,000 Japanese. 1,462 Japanese dead in front of a single battalion. 70 American casualties. The arithmetic of that night is almost impossible to comprehend unless you understand what was behind it. And what was behind it was not luck. It was not superior weapons. The Japanese had rifles and machine guns and grenades and mortars. It was not courage. The Japanese had courage to a degree that borders on the incomprehensible. They charged into machine gun fire knowing they would die, and they charged again and again and again. What was behind it was preparation. Weeks of digging, wiring, registering, clearing, building, and positioning, directed by a man who had spent 23 years learning exactly how to build the kind of defense that the Japanese hit on the night of October 24. Puller had fought in jungles since he was 21. He had seen men charge prepared positions and die. He had built those positions. He knew what worked and what did not. And when he was given a sector to defend at Henderson Field, he built a killing ground with the precision of a man who had been doing it longer than most of his Marines had been alive. The Japanese assumption, the assumption that had won them every war since 1895, was that spirit overcomes fire, that the side willing to accept more casualties will break the side that is not. That courage is the decisive factor in infantry combat. Puller's defense of Henderson Field proved that this assumption has a limit. It proved that there is a point at which no amount of courage can carry men through interlocking machine gun fire, pre-registered artillery, and canister rounds fired at close range into massed formations. It proved that preparation, when done correctly by a commander who understands it, creates a mathematical reality that spirit cannot overcome. The Japanese soldiers who charged Puller's Wire on the night of October 24 were not lacking in courage. They were among the bravest men who ever fought in any war. But they were charging into a position that had been designed by a man who had spent 2 decades designing such positions to kill them, and it did. This is the answer that the Japanese diaries and after-action reports grope toward without ever quite reaching. They note the volume of fire, they note the wire, they note the artillery. Colonel Furumiya himself speculated in his diary that the Americans might be using machine guns operated by remote control, because he could not believe that so few men could produce so much fire. The answer was simpler than remote control. The answer was that every gun had been placed by a man who knew exactly where it needed to be, with fields of fire cleared to the inch, barrels pointed at ground that the enemy would have to cross, registered on ranges that had been walked and measured in daylight, so that in darkness the guns could fire without aiming and hit what they were pointed at. And behind the guns stood the man himself, on the field telephone, directing fire, coordinating the defense, refusing to waver. Puller later said it plainly. We held them because we were well dug in, a whole regiment of artillery was backing us up, and there was plenty of barbed wire. There is no mystery in that sentence. There is only the hard truth that the battle was won before the first Japanese soldier reached the wire. Puller received his 3rd Navy Cross for the defense of Henderson Field. His citation noted that while holding a mile-long front in a heavy downpour of rain against a Japanese force superior in number that launched vigorous assaults through dense jungle, he not only held his battalion to its position until reinforcements arrived 3 hours later, but also effectively commanded the augmented force until late the following afternoon. He would go on to earn a 4th Navy Cross at Cape Gloucester in 1944 and a 5th at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea in 1950, making him the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps. He retired as a Lieutenant General in 1955 and died on October 11, 1971, in Virginia, the state where he was born. Sergeant John Basilone, the machine gunner who held the center of Puller's line, was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted Marine to receive it in the Second World War. He was sent home for war bond tours and could have stayed there. He was famous, he was safe, he volunteered to go back. On February 19, 1945, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone landed on Iwo Jima with the 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. He was killed in action on the first day, struck by mortar fragments while leading his machine gun platoon across the volcanic ash of Red Beach 2. He was 28 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 12, grave 384. When Basilone accepted the Medal of Honor for Henderson Field, he said only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal. He did not say which pieces. He did not have to. Captain Jiro Katsumata, the man who led the 11th Company into Puller's Wire and crawled back through a field of his own dead, survived his wounds. His account of the night was recorded after the war and preserved in Japanese military archives. He described the approach, the charge, the wire, the noise, the fire, and the dead. He described being hit 3 times and lying among the bodies while the machine guns kept firing. He did not describe bravery. He did not describe cowardice. He described a wall of fire that no amount of human courage could penetrate, delivered by men he never saw, from positions he could not locate, with a precision that seemed mechanical rather than human. That precision was not mechanical. It was the work of a man who had been building positions like that one since 1919, in jungles that history forgot, against enemies that no one remembers, in wars that earned him nothing but the knowledge of exactly what a prepared defense can do to brave men who charge it in the dark. Henderson Field never fell. The Marines held it from the day they captured it on August 7th, 1942, until the Japanese were driven from Guadalcanal in February of 1943. The Cactus Air Force flew from it every day the weather allowed, denying the Japanese control of the sea and the sky. The battle that Puller fought on the night of October 24 was the closest the Japanese ever came to taking it back. After that night, they never had the strength to try again at the same scale. Many historians consider Guadalcanal the turning point of the Pacific War, the campaign where Japan's offensive expansion was finally broken and the long road to Tokyo began. Henderson Field was the reason. And on the night that mattered most, the night when the field's survival hung on a single battalion holding a line too long for its numbers, that battalion was commanded by a man who had been preparing for that exact fight for 23 years. The Japanese soldiers who died in front of Puller's Wire were not defeated by cowardice or incompetence. They were defeated by the accumulated knowledge of a man who had learned, in the forgotten jungles of Haiti and Nicaragua, that war is not won by the side that is willing to die. War is won by the side that is ready. Louis Puller was ready. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in the Pacific. If there was a grandfather or a great-uncle or a neighbor who was on Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima or Okinawa or any of the islands where these men fought and bled and died so far from home, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.